I want you to take a second and explain the lighting schematic that you would set up for this shot. Pay attention to the details of where the highlights are, where the shadows are, and the purity of the background. Think about how you would set this shot up. So how was it done? It was done with a theory and a process called high key. High key photography uses unnaturally bright light to blow out most of the harsh shadows in an image. Really perfect for product photography, perfect for portraiture, but looking at the background and they're saying it's blown out. So just be careful that the background is blown out and not the subject. And we're going to look at different techniques how to ensure that you're blowing out the background and not your subject. Like I said, when do you want a high key? You want a high key for model photography, you want a high key for product photography. Product photography is perfect for this because it brings your attention directly to the object that's for sale. Think about what kind of brands might use high key photography. Spend a minute or two and think about the brands that use high key. Think about technology. Think about food service. Think about portraiture and retail. Who and what uses high key photography? Apple is notorious for high key. Look at all of the details that it brings to your product. Cosmetic companies use high key especially because they want to make sure the color integrity of all of their images are accurate. If you were to put any of this makeup onto a pink background or a blue background, the color fidelity is going to be off. And then you're going to be dealing with comparative color, which isn't as accurate. And look at Adidas using high key to really showcase their bright, vibrant colors. High key typically has a very happy, upbeat feel to it. It's very modern, it's very clean. So now that you know what high key is, let's talk about how to do this. You've got two ways of accomplishing high key. You can do it in the studio. Studio lighting makes things a lot easier because you can control every aspect of it. Otherwise, you should shoot outdoors on a bright sunny day. Fortunately, here we've got our studio, and as long as you schedule studio time ahead of time, everyone should have an opportunity to be able to do this in the studio. If for some reason you can't, that's fine, but then make sure you're paying attention on how to do this outdoors and check ahead for the weather to make sure that you don't have a week of overcast rainy days. So in the studio, you're gonna need a white seamless roll. Put your white backdrop up, and then you're going to do a 3 light 45-degree setup with a background light. So 45 degrees on your front, 2 lights facing the portrait with even lighting unless you're trying to intentionally create drama. Set your lights up with the umbrella as a shoot through and your third light low behind the subject pointed at your background. You're now creating a lot of light in a small space with lots of white around you, so that light's going to start bouncing all over the place. When the light starts bouncing all over the place, you need to make sure that it's not creating these awkward halos and washing out your subject. So if that happens, pull your subject away from the background, pull your forward lighting further away from your subject, and give yourself more space between each integral. You want to make sure you're blowing out the backdrop enough to make sure it's pretty much solid white. If it's off by a slight shade, that's fine. We can fix it in post-production. However, for the most part, you really want your background pure white and your subject not blown out. Don't forget to meter. We talk about metering a lot. You guys know how to do this, you know when to do this, but don't forget to meter. You're going to want to make sure that your subject is 1 or 2 steps darker than your background. Think about this and think it through. You're going to also want to lengthen the exposure to brighten your scene as much as you can. Don't blow out your highlights, but you're still going to need a longer shutter speed, which lets in more light. And longer shutter speeds create what? Camera shake. So make sure you're on a tripod or you're making sure that your models don't have significant amounts of movement to them. Now, if you're gonna high key outside, it's a little bit more challenging. Your first step is to find a non-distracting background. Think about where you can find maybe a white wall, the side of a building, or even a garage. Your background tone needs to be continuous. It needs to be the same color. If you can't find solid white or a solid cream, make sure, if nothing else, it's the same tone. If it has patterns in it, it's going to be harder for you to get that pure white high key look. Then you're going to have to overexpose the background. Don't forget, you're overexposing it by 1 or 2 stops, which is the same thing you have to do in the studio. But make sure there aren't blown out highlights when you overexpose the scene. The easiest way to do that is to turn on your clipping notification and to look at your histogram. What's that you just said? I need to make sure that I'm using my histogram? I do that how? Okay. Well, your histogram is awesome. It's important inside and outside, frankly, but using your histogram will give you the best indication as to how your shot is structured. If you look at your histograms, which are all accessible on your cameras through the play button and the display modes, it will show you this chart. This chart talks about the shadows on the left, the midtones of your image in the middle, and the highlights to the right. We looked at this when we did low-key photography. So, highlights, midtones, shadows. When we did low-key, we wanted the spike to be in the shadows to ensure that our shadows were plugged up. Now we want to make sure that all of this is normal, there's nothing spiking on the left, and that we have a spike on the right to show that just a touch of our highlights are blown out. Okay, so here's your overexposure, underexposure guide. Very simply, 2 stops overexposed, 2 stops underexposed, and we keep saying you want to make sure you're in the 2 stops overexposed guide. So if you look at what the histogram looks like for when you're 2 stops overexposed, you've got that spike to the right. Like we just talked about with low key, and this is what you're used to seeing, is the spike for plugged up shadows is to the left. Now we're looking at the spike to the right to make sure that your shot is nice and open. If you were just to look at the histogram and nothing but the histogram, would you guess that this shot is perfectly exposed, is high key, or is low key? This is the histogram that came out of that shot. It's a low key shot, which should make sense being that we saw the histogram was pushed towards the left. Looking at this histogram, do you suspect that this shot produces a high key or a low key photograph? It's a high key shot, as indicated by a lack of data in your backgrounds. Is it a good high key shot? No, it's too much. Okay? You need to make sure that even though your background is overexposed, your subject isn't. So in this case, the photographer should have taken the subject away from the light source, away from the background, and darkened their exposure probably by 1, if not 2 stops, because this is grossly overexposed. One of the safest things you can do for yourself is to turn on your highlight warning. You can find it in your menu setting, and what it will do is make your screen blink wherever you have clipping. Clipping being 0 data in your photograph. You want your background of your shot to have 0 data. So if your clipping warning is coming up and clipping and flashing just in your backgrounds and not in your subject's face or in the body of whatever object you're choosing to shoot, then you're in good shape. Here are a couple of examples of high key product photography shots and portraiture work. Notice that even when you're dealing with white subjects on a white background, you can still see edges. You can still see details in your shots. Okay? The shot isn't so grossly overexposed that you're losing detail in your subject. And here are the resources from where slide 1 came from, proving that we do indeed know how to look for open source images.